So I first came to North Wales ringing back in December 1976. Oh, half a minute, my slide hasn't advanced. So this photograph wasn't actually taken in 1976, but a group from Washwader Ringing Group with Clive Minton came up to Scan in December 76 to assist Scan in its early days with making some wader catches. It was a particularly snowy weekend. Our accommodation was a farm over on the mainland near Wieg. We were given some of the outbuildings. Our vehicle was particularly lucky in that we had the straw bales. Some of the other people were staying in the cattle sheds. At the time I was only 14, but my parents had met Clive on several occasions. So I was allowed to go along and we had a fantastic weekend. We caught a very big catch of dunlin on Laird's Beach, looking across at the Carneddau and various other Welsh mountains covered in snow. We also, one of the following days, we were along near a Pen Mon and made one of the bigger catches of knot that have ever been made in North Wales. We caught 90, including several foreign controls. This had the impact on me that I was very keen to come to Bangor for university. So I was actually a student here from 1980 to 1983, doing quite a lot of ringing, passerine ringing, in addition to all the wader ringing I was doing. And then I moved to Herefordshire and had 20 odd years in Herefordshire. And then my circumstances changed, and also working for the RSPB, they particularly wanted me to move up to Bangor, which suited me very well. And in 2009, I moved back up to Bangor. One of the things while I was in Herefordshire, I'd started a constant effort site, which is one of the schemes that BTO have particularly promoted since the mid-1990s, as getting a better scientific value from ringers rather than just going out doing casual ringing. And I'd been operating a site on wetland in Herefordshire belonging to Weston cider. It's where their wastewater was going through a newly planted reed bed and willow bed to purify it before it was put out into the environment. And that had been very successful. And I was very keen when I moved up here to look to find a suitable site to carry out a constant effort site. And I had a chat with Reg Thorpe, and he suggested I had a chat with Ian Hawkins. And Ian's been extremely supportive all along and suggested that RSPB would actually be quite happy for us to have a constant effort site. It was structured ringing like this, where there's good scientific data coming out of. RSPB are very supportive. And we duly in 2008 did a provisional catch to just work out where we might put nets and whether it would work or not. Sorry, it was 2009. And then from 2010 onwards, we operated a constant effort site there. And to make it effective for looking at long-term monitoring, we basically go out netting once in every 10 to 11 day period from the 1st of May to the end of August. The exact dates vary subtly each year. The BTO try and skew them slightly so it works well with bank holidays and other things. So there's give people a reasonable chance of managing to fulfill most of the visits. And the idea is to use the same nets every time, so that you put in the same amount of netting up, and you do a consistent netting period. And on Anglesey, we've chosen to start setting the nets 30 minutes before sunrise and start taking down 4.5 hours later. We've particularly gone for very early in the morning. Partly that's when birds are moving, but also Anglesey, as many of you are aware, it's quite exposed and very readily picks up wind. And you often find that come sort of 9:30 o'clock, it's getting really quite breezy and the nets stop being effective. So yes, in midsummer, our alarm goes off at 3:10 for us to get up, have a bit of breakfast, or in Rachel's case, just have some coffee, drive across to Corstegger, be there for 4:10 and start setting the nets. And the outputs from constant effort sites, It has several here. One is particularly to change in adult abundance. Because it's working on a number of sites across the UK, the numbers start to get up that you can start to do some statistics on the abundance. We also look at the number of juveniles that are produced each year and relate that to the number of adults caught. So it's an index of productivity rather than actual total number of juveniles. And by combining a large number of sites together, adult survival could be monitored. Will Peach did a paper many years ago looking at sedge warbler survival across constant effort sites, and particularly linking it into Sahel droughts in their wintering quarters. So there's about 30 species that are monitored at a national scale, and a few of those can also be looked at a regional level. So this is a map from 2019 of the constant effort sites across the UK. There's about just over 130, sorry. It's gone down slightly after the last couple of years because COVID rather affected things. But as you'll notice, it's very heavily dominated to the Midlands and the East. And there's only 10 sites in Wales and a few in Scotland and a very small number in Ireland. So it's really quite important to be doing some monitoring within Wales. Obviously, you can see Corsthigger up the north. Sadly, the site at Stumflin has now stopped, with Kelvin having moved up to Conway. I think he's in the process of trying to start a new CES up there. And then Ian Spence, I think, has the other North Walian site over in Flint. So this is a view of the couple of our nets at the constant effort site. That net really needs replacing in the near future, most unpleasant hole. So our first year was 2010, and the graph here, really we've just combined all the birds caught over the year in this graph to just give you an idea of how the numbers change. I do want to point out a cautionary when we're looking at some of the other graphs later on, that in 2014, unfortunately, we missed visits 8 and 9, which are actually periods when there's quite a lot of juveniles and probably some of the busier sessions. But Rachel and I were in Greenland that summer. And in 2020, we missed visits 1 to 6. COVID restrictions meant that we couldn't operate until 1st of July, but we did complete the other 7 sessions. Sorry, sessions 7 through till 12. So rather than take those points out of graphs, just bear in mind if there are dips in those particular years, that's the particular reason. And you'll notice there's a white break in the middle. This is down to a couple of pest species. When we started, there were no bitterns breeding at Corsthigger. There were no marsh harriers breeding at Corsthigger. Very much on the management plan, and RSPB was desperately hoping that they would start. But in 2017, well, 2016 was the first year that bitterns bred, and Ian had a chat with us, and we modified how we went round the nets so as to minimise disturbance. But because they're skulking and stay in the reeds, he was comfortable that with our modifications, we could carry on our operations. But early May 2017, Ian rang me up and said, "I'm very sorry, Steve, there's a marsh harrier right in the middle of your CES. It's nesting and it'll get up every time you try and go round. I'm afraid you're just going to have to stop it." But to be fair to Ian, he was extremely helpful. He did suggest an alternative area. So we managed to get round, look at the site, work things out, and get the CES set up within that week and fulfill the full set of sessions. So that is why throughout the slides, as we carry on, we've had to move around because of these species, which obviously is delightful they've turned up. I think we're the only 2 people who've grumbled and muttered about it. So looking, obviously 2 of the key species in the reed beds at Corsthigger, reed warblers and sedge warblers. You'll notice total number we catch each year. It varies. obviously the dip in 2014 is partly due to the us not making a couple of the visits, and the dip in 2020 is making a difference because of the number of visits. But you'll notice they do fluctuate a little bit year to year. Interesting that 2019 was a low year compared with some of the others around, particularly for reed warblers. And then I've produced the number of juveniles caught that season against the number of adults to get the productivity index. So 2010 was a phenomenally good breeding season, whereas 2012 was a particularly poor one. And these sort of things, BTO rarely looks at this to site level. And I think one's got to be a bit cautious as I present these graphs, that it's give you an indication of what's going on at one site, but obviously the sample size is not huge. But by the time you're looking across 100 sites across the UK, or even if you go to regional level and looking at 10 sites in Wales, you get a much better precision as to how things are going on. And interestingly, actually this year, although it seemed like it was quite a reasonable year, has ended up as a relatively poor breeding season, at least for the two warblers. Two of the other species we catch in good numbers on the site are reed buntings and wren. Wren jumps around quite a bit all over the place. I have to admit that I can't remember which the harsh winters were, but I seem to recall 2010, 2011 was quite a cold winter, which will have caused a drop in the numbers. Whereas some of the more milder recent years, survival's been good and you've got good numbers around. 2020, the dip is very much because we've missed catching adults during the first 6 visits. Reed buntings also varies year to year, but there again, it's quite a small sample size, so one has to be a little bit cautious. And reed buntings are very much mimic the other reed bed species in their productivity, whereas a wren very much seems to yo-yo around. Again, I haven't tied it into weather factors. It gives you an idea of the type of data we get from this. Blackcap is not really much of a breeding species down on Corstigger. So the sites are in the reed bed and the sort of the scrubby hedgerows around the site. So it's not really proper blackcap breeding habitat. There are small numbers breeding down there, and we do get quite a lot of juveniles that come down into the wetlands that have presumably bred in some of the neighbouring woodlands. So it's not ideal to start presenting that with an index. There are lots of willow warblers in breeding in the site, so a productivity index is very relevant there. Again, 2010 was a phenomenal year for them. I don't know why it was particularly good. Otherwise, it's tended to oscillate round about the same sort of level, but a poorer year in 2021, but they bounced back a bit this year, not suffered as much as the reed bed species. And in the top graph here, both blackcap and, for the same reason, chiffchaff, there's only probably a couple of pairs breeding down on the site, but we catch a lot of juveniles, and almost certainly they come down from the surrounding woodlands and hedgerows into the wetland site. And possibly with it being particularly dry last summer, chiffchaffs were more inclined to come down to the wetland site where there was abundant source of insects. We catch a smattering of Chessie's warblers on the site, always delightful to have. The bottom graph show you some of the other key species we do catch, but the numbers we catch, really I'm not prepared to give any trends on. It just gives you an idea of what's going on. This new CES seems to be better for bullfinches than the old one, and 2021 seemed to be a particularly good breeding season. Chessie's warbler had a particularly good breeding season this year. We caught far more than we've ever caught before. Dunnocks and blackbirds, they oscillate around, but again, I'm not prepared to sort of give anything firm on that because the sample sizes are too small. And we catch, when we're lucky, the odd other bird. Ian Wright may well remember the bird in the top left. He went along to the net when he was coming out with us and said, "Steve, there's a great reed warbler in the net." Hadn't been seen or heard beforehand. I took it along and presented this to Rachel because I handled them abroad. And she thought she got a redwing until she opened the bag. They are huge compared with the other warblers. Whereas a reed warbler typically weighs 10 or 11 grams, great reed warbler is 30, 35 grams. And I believe a couple of people did hear it a day or so afterwards, and then it disappeared. Other birds, one morning we came back to the net and we were just about to take it down, and there was this lovely male cuckoo in the net. It's the only one I've ever handled. And we've caught the odd stone chats at the site. Apologies for my fingernails. And we catch a smattering of jays, which are always great fun to handle. In 2011, I was extremely lucky to go on one of the provisioning trips out to Skerries. For those of you who don't know, RSPB has a couple of wardens living out there through the breeding season and takes food out to them every 10 days. And the trips are offered out to staff. And I went out there. It is a fantastic place. It's absolutely buzzing with terns. Main colony is Arctic terns, of which there's several thousand pairs, but there's also 300 or 400 pairs of common terns, and the odd roseate tern are about. Anyway, I did some thinking and was thinking, yeah. So one of the other projects BTOs particularly asked ringers to consider is to ring adults for survival. Adults very often are site faithful when they're breeding of a wide range of species, and they're encouraging ringers to think about projects that they might carry out that they can potentially monitor adult survival over a good number of years. Particularly popular species are pied flycatchers because they can be caught in nest boxes. Dippers with colour rings work very well. Swallows, breeding swallows coming into a number of farms are popular, and sand martins. But there are a range of other species which are encouraged to think about. So we had a chat with Ian Sims and Alistair Morley, and it was agreed we would trial doing a project working on Arctic terns on the Skerries, monitoring the survival of adults. So in 2013, Rachel and I went out. We took some of our weld mesh out and we made up these lobster pot cages. We usually made up 5, and we'd find nests and set the 5 traps up fairly close to each other. They want to be 3 or 4 yards apart on a little area, and just stand back and watch. And the great thing about working at the Skerries is you can just stand in the surrounds of the lighthouse and all the terns settle back in, carry on with their normal thing. And the terns will quietly walk around and trying to work out how to go back in onto their nest. And you just wait until you've got 3 or 4 of them in the traps, and then quietly go down, pull them out of the traps. And it doesn't matter if we don't need to catch every bird. If bird's chosen not to go back into the trap, we just move the traps onto a different area and take the birds back up. And we put metal ring on. And the other thing we're using is a leg flag. And this allows us to monitor the birds by resighting the birds rather than having to catch the birds again. And I ummed and ahed, given that we've got such a short legs, to whether to use colouring with an engraving or to use leg flags. And we've been using leg flags a lot on wading birds over the last decade. And I was also aware that leg flags have been used on terns quite a bit by Clive Minton in Australia, and sort of had a chat with him as whether there had been any issues. He said, no, it worked very, very well. So we were actually the first scheme in the UK to start using leg flags on terns. 2-character inscription. And while we were ringing and putting the leg flags on the tern, we were taking measurements. So there's to hopefully sort out the sexes of many of the birds. But we've also asked the wardens when they see the birds, if they say any particular behaviour that confirms whether it's a male or a female bird, because there's quite a lot of overlap in the measurements, to see if we can sort of help separate those out. And this is an image taken a bit later on in the day of one we'd ringed, looking through a telescope. And this project has worked extremely well. A lot of the resightings are done by the wardens. And the main restriction is you need to try and do the resightings in periods when the birds are not actually incubating. So when they're doing the courtship, when they're first back, or when they're feeding young chicks. During incubation, when the birds get up, fly around, when they come back to the nest, they're back and sat down before you have time to actually get round to reading the leg flag. And this is a graph looking at the survival rate and the resighting probability running over the years. Now, the green line is the resighting probability. And it really just gives an indication of what proportion of the birds around and that are alive the computer model reckons you've managed to re-see. Whereas the red line is the bit that we're interested in, seeing how survival varies with time. I'm sorry this has come straight out of the computer program, Mark. I haven't processed it in an Excel file. So the years run from 2014 through to 2022. You'll notice the big drop, from 2013 through to 2022. You'll notice a big drop in parameter 4. That was when there was an outbreak of botulism on the island in 2016. So running from 2016 through to 2017, we've done most of the resightings in 2016 before the botulism outbreak occurred. That occurred sort of in early July. And that's explains the drop in survival rate then. Then the other tricky year is 2020, that because of COVID, RSPB felt it was not appropriate for wardens to be out on the island. We didn't know at that stage what the impacts were going to be. There were lots of government restrictions of what we could do. So there was no warden out on the island, so obviously no resightings. There was also the complication that because there were no wardens there, Ian did manage to get out and do a couple of visits, but discovered that there was an immature peregrine that was tending to loaf on top of the lighthouse, and the vast majority of the colony deserted. Quite a few were resighted at Kemlyn, and Kemlyn had quite a number of terns turn up in response to the desertion. Quite why the graph hasn't picked up quite so well in 2021, I'm not sure. The final parameter is a false parameter because unfortunately the program can't separate resighting rate from survival probability on the final data point. So if you notice, the two actually are identical. But hopefully with this forthcoming season's data, we'll get a bit of a clear idea of what's going on with the terns there. But it's been very successful. Given the success of it, we had a word, we discussed with Ian and RSPB, and this scheme has also been extended to common terns. We're not going to try and maintain quite as big a sample marked. You'll notice this has got a yellow leg flag on rather than orange flag. As much as anything to just make it easy for an observer, they haven't got to actually identify the species of the tern as well as read the flag. They can just look at the colour of the flag and they sorted out which species it is. We originally started this round the back of the wall garden, if you know the island, but the following year, these pesky Schedule 1 species keep getting in the way of our work. And roseate tern started to breed around there. So we've actually moved our study site now to around the helipad, which is actually easier to observe from the surrounds of the lighthouse. So it's much better. In 2016, we also carried out some GPS tagging of a few of the Arctic terns. The Roseate Tern Life Project was contemplating wanting to do some tagging of roseate terns somewhere on one of the colonies, and we've done quite a bit of work with small GPS tags on redshank and curlew at this stage, and suggest it might be possible to do a trial on 10 Arctic terns on the Skerries. So we caught them in a similar way to how we caught the ones for flagging, and fitted the glue-mounted tag to the back. And these were doing remote download to base stations. And we basically set the tags up to do fixes every 5 minutes for a couple of hours a day. At such a high intensity throughout the day, we'd have drained the battery too quickly. So we did a small window, but we set different birds up to be recording at different times of the day. And at the same time, Martin Perrow, who's done a lot of boat tracking of terns, thought it was an excellent opportunity to compare the results from his techniques with our techniques. So he came along and spent 10 days at the same time as us, working with Diggs and his inflatable, and they'd hang around off the island, look and identify a random tern coming off to fish, and they would follow that tern. So we got an awful lot of data. I haven't got pictures here of the individual tracks, but we wanted to compare the key areas which the birds were foraging between the different techniques. So the top left-hand map is looking at Martin Perrow's tracks based on 10-second intervals. The top right is looking at his work running with 5 minute intervals, which would mimic the intervals used with the GPS tags. And then in the bottom two maps, we're looking at the intensity based off the GPS tags. And you'll see there's extremely similar areas. So it shows that the two techniques are giving very, very similar results. What we're perhaps showing with the GPSs was we're picking up the odd bird that goes further west on longer forays than perhaps he was able to follow with a boat. But it was an extremely interesting project to work on. It proved quite time consuming to finish off all the analyses and pull the whole thing together, because obviously there were a lot of different people working on this project, but it's ended up as a very good paper, giving people good insight on different techniques of finding out where birds could be tracked. Back 5 years ago, Ben Stammers and Chris Wynne contacted me from North Wales Wildlife Trust and said, we'd quite like to do some marking of some of the sandwich tern chicks, if it was possible, at Kemlyn. Try and get a bit more of an idea of what their movements are, and know a little bit more about sandwich terns at Kemlyn. And I sort of said, yeah, sounds like a good idea. Let's think about how we want to do this. And I suggested that perhaps leg flagging again would be a very similar, very good plan. And in 2019, a group of 4 of us as ringers went out to the island with a number of wardens who were helping sort of catch the birds, also making sure that any gulls, chicks weren't trying to swim too far off from the island, otherwise just gently surround the island. And a couple of people were on the shingle bar, you know, talking to members of the public, telling them what's going on. And we very successfully ringed 125 chicks and fitted them with leg flags. One of the birds here, actually from 2022, being leg flagged here. And bird on the right was sighted down in Namibia. So this is the map of the sightings we've had from all the sandwich terns we've done. So we did a sample in 2019. 2020, it was inappropriate because with the second surge of Arctic terns and common terns from the Skerries, at the time when we would need to ring the chicks, there were an awful lot of other tern species on eggs. And Chris quite rightly felt it was inappropriate to be on the site and causing birds to be in the air where you've got a lot of birds on eggs. And unfortunately, the weather just went against us. We had a cold week in June in 2021, but we got out and did a similar sample again in 2022. So a lot of these sightings are from 2019 and 2022. As you'll see from Kemlyn, a lot of birds were re-sighted by an enthusiastic team of observers, Ross-on-Sea, the River Clwyd, quite a few on Hillborough, and quite a lot in Liverpool Bay at Formby. But also quite a scattering of these was re-sighted down through Wales, across to Ireland, and a smattering up into Scotland. Then, if you look on the map on the right, a few of the French and Spanish sightings were on Autumn Passage. We've had several sightings in Gambia in sort of October, November time, one in Guinea-Bissau and one in Mauritania. And then a number of birds have been sighted in the winter months down in Namibia and South Africa. Several of the sightings up around Netherlands, Denmark and Germany are actually in subsequent breeding seasons. So one adult was seen in De Putten in, oh, sorry, my memory's gone, in Holland in 13th of May 2022, seen 4 days later on Coker Island off Northumberland. And 2 adults were seen in mid-July in both Germany and Belgium. Interestingly, of the 125 chicks we ringed in 2019, only 6 birds were seen at Kemlyn this year. I mean, my personal goal was hoping that, you know, if we ring a decent sample for 3 or 4 years, we'll get enough adults that we can have sandwich turns as another re-sighting RAS to work alongside the 2 projects on skerries. But obviously, we've got a way to go before that if we've only got 6 birds back. Anyway, hopefully this project will carry on into the future. Other projects. So Rachel tells me off sometimes. I get new projects set up, lots of time commitment, always want to keep doing them year after year. She says, well, you know, sometimes it's a good idea to perhaps not do something you're going to keep repeating. At the end of the day, we've got to remember, I'm keen to provide science with the ringing, but it's my hobby. It's meant to be fun. So it's important to make sure that sometimes one has fun. And in the early 2010s, I was working with RSPB on a project on yellowhammers. And part of that was working with farmers, and we were trying to provide seed sources for them through the winter. And one of the techniques for that was getting ryegrass to produce a superabundance of seed that it was available for the buntings to use in the winter. This was following on some work I successfully carried out in Shropshire and Staffordshire in the late 2000s. And we wanted to see how it would work in Wales. So on the farms we were working on, the right-hand side of the field, as we're looking at, had been cut for silage, but the left-hand part, he'd taken his first cut of silage, then fertilised it, and it produced a good stand of ryegrass seed heads, which were then allowed to fall as a mat. And the theory was that if it got a good mat, birds could stand on the mat of grass seed stems and just slide their beak up the grass seed stem and get a superabundant bit of seeds off. Obviously, there's been a bit of grass growth, but this field was also being used by hooper swans. So I thought, I quite fancy having a go for some hooper swans. So along the join between the smooth and the rough grass, we hid 2 cannon nets. And with a couple of hours of gentle walking around the edge of the field, the hooper swans gradually moved closer and closer. And we got a catch of 10 hooper swans. We took them out, put them in sacks, working through. And here you've got most of the team, apart from myself, in view. A number of my trainees at the time, and across on the left-hand side, Phil Woolen from Chester. He's been a great stalwart with a lot of our scan ringing and enjoys getting involved in other things. And of course, Rachel in the front right, talking through. So all of the hooper swans, we got leg Darviks off the WWT. So they were all fitted with leg Darviks. And we particularly wanted to take a photograph of each of the hooper swans next to the leg darvic. So if anyone wants to do any further work, I'm sure many of you are aware that a lot of Buick swans get identified at Slimbridge by their beak markings. And presumably one can do something reasonably similar with hooper swans. So we thought it was appropriate to take 2 photographs of each bird along with their leg darvic. And from the 10 swans we caught, a lot of them were juveniles, but 8 of them we had resightings at various times. A couple, when they came back in I lost my plot for a second. So a couple in 2015, when they came back, were seen on Cromarty Firth in Highland, and then moved down to Lancashire, Martinmere in Lancashire, only 9 days later, before returning and being seen on the Glaslyn in January. One of the juveniles was resighted 18 months later, almost 2 years later, over in Cambridgeshire. One of the adult female was seen at a site in Iceland. And we had another of the juveniles that was seen up in Calaverock and on Loch Ryan. And one of the other juveniles was seen at Shopwick in Flint. So fantastic to get so many sightings of and seeing some of the interlinks between our Welsh hooper swan flock and other key hooper swan sites. It's a bit disappointing we haven't managed to get more resightings actually within the Glaslyn itself, but they have quite a tendency to choose 1 or 2 of the fields that there isn't easy public access to, and also fields with longer grass, which makes it quite challenging to read the colourings. But still, great fun. And as I say, it was a one-off. It was great to do, but a long way if I wasn't working down there regularly to sort of do the lot of the recce's. In a similar vein, I was aware, you know, back when I was a student, Brent goose was quite a rare bird in North Wales. If you were lucky, there were 2 or 3 around, seen around Llanberis or occasionally on Triflavon. If you're lucky, you might see 1 or 2 in Forth Bay. Obviously, the pale-bellied Brent geese had increased hugely in North Wales, with the increase of the birds wintering Ireland, overspilling and using sites on the mainland now. So I thought it'd be quite fun, something different. We would try and catch some of the Brent geese. So I had a chat with the Irish Brent goose group, and they very kindly gave me some darvics to put on pale-bellied Brent geese. And we first tried out at Fort Belan before I got colourings to try and catch some Brent geese, and it didn't work. Things just didn't go quite right. But there was a field at the forward, a grass field with the pool in, that the Brent geese were regularly grazing on in the February. So I had a chat with the farmer, and he was very helpful and supportive and said, yes, yeah, you could set a couple of nets on the field. And I set the nets really, really close to the field boundary. I thought, you know, I must be at least 50 metres into the field because, you know, they're generally walking along the far side of the pool, and they're not really going to want, with me looking over the hedge, want to come really, really close to the fence. So we duly set the nets and we're waiting. And about 60 Brent geese, 3 times they walked between the net and me in the hedgerow. On the 3rd time, I reckon we got enough just in the corner of the catch, and we fired and we caught 15 Brent geese. And I thought, you know, the common Brent goose there is pale-bellied Brent geese. And all the Brent geese look the same. And when you've got them in the hand, and it's not the same as when you look at birds in the field. I thought they were all pale-bellied, and we duly got on colouring them all. And this is the photograph of them being released, and they were all dark-bellied. This has provided Regthorpe with huge entertainment every time he sees them, and I do find it slightly embarrassing. However, it's actually been fantastic. Thankfully, we didn't go across any other colourings on the dark-bellied rings flight scheme, and I've worked with the liaise with the people in Holland, Netherlands, and we provide sightings and they provide sightings. And we've had a tremendous history from the 15 dark bellies that we've ringed. I'm afraid I haven't put them up as maps. So you're just going to have to be a little bit patient. We'll sort of talk through some of the sightings. So the plumage of the birds is identical. To sex the bird, my partner in crime, Rachel, is given the bird and turns it upside down, and she has to examine the cloaca to see whether it's got a penis or not. So that is whether they're males or females. This bird, obviously January 18 is when we caught the bird. Seen in May in Germany on passage. Seen back here again, winter 2018. Interestingly, in April on passage, it went through Holland, although that's earlier. So whether it then moved on to Germany and a different bit of the Wadden Sea, I don't know. And again, seen back here in winter 2019-20. In May 20, it was seen again in Germany, fairly close to where it was seen the first time on passage, and it's been seen back here in 2021. Another bird, again seen in Holland on passage. This bird got to Holland as early as 26th of March, stayed around through until May, and actually mid-May before it got around to moving on. Back here again in the winter, following winter again through Friesland. Back here again in, in April 22. It wasn't seen until April 22. And interesting, it didn't leave here until the 4th of April in 2022. So there's quite a bit of variation year to year as to when they actually do their migration from here across. W4NC was actually mated with W7NB. So lots of sightings have been the two together. Again, going through Holland on migration, getting there 30th of March like the other bird, staying through until mid-May. Back here again, so regularly coming back to the forage for wintering. So yeah, lots of data on that bird. And again on this one. And then a rather surprising one. This bird hadn't been seen at all on passage going through Europe, but in 18th September 2020, it was seen at Tralee in southwest Ireland with another dark-bellied goose and with a juvenile. I mean, here is previously when it was seen foraging with pale bellies on the forehead, and the suspicion is it migrated with some of the pale bellies and its mate, migrated with the pale bellies through northern Canada and has come back through Tralee with them on autumn migration. So fascinating. I mean, we have actually subsequently also made a catch at Penmon of pale-bellied Brent geese and fitted colourings with those. I haven't presented you with the sightings from those. At the moment, I'm still waiting for a number from Ireland. They've got various issues with their websites. So resightings of pale-bellied Brent geese are not actually getting through very reliably at the moment. Redwing, lovely bird to catch. And the reference to the Latvian love song was in 2014, a tape law that derived from Latvia proved to be so much more effective than other tape laws used for redwing. And it means you can actually catch big numbers of redwing in the autumn responding to this tape law. So they're a nice bird to catch. They're a lovely size in the hand. You're always exciting, wondering where you're going to get recoveries from them, and the fact they move on through. And it's the time of the year when you're not necessarily catching many other exciting birds. All the summer migrants have gone. You might be starting to get the odd brambling in if you're in the right sort of place, but redwing are good to do. For those of you who are not familiar with redwing in the hand, the bird on the left is an adult, and you'll notice on the greater coverts, sorry, I'm sort of practiced doing pointer. I don't know whether my pointer shows up, but the greater coverts here, there are no pale tips. I mean, quite often there will be pale tips, but they'll only be sort of gentle kiss on the edge. And the juvenile on the right, the greater coverts, they've got pale edges. And I'm sorry, I haven't got it with an open wing, but they actually form a thorn shape. And that's one of the reliable ways for separating an adult from a juvenile. Again, the other way to separate them is by looking at tail feather shape. And I'm afraid I'm a great doer when I'm out in the field, and I'm not very good at having my camera out. So I'm afraid throughout the talk, I'm struggling a little bit, but not necessarily having quite as many photographs as I might. Anyway, since 2014, I've been catching good numbers of redwing on autumn passage. And one of the things you can look at is variation in productivity. I'm not doing this as part of any formal BTO scheme, but the sample size is significant. In 2014, 2015, I was sort of catching 50 or 80 birds. Many of the years since then, I've been catching 200 or 300 redwing in autumn passage. So you'll notice that most of the time you've got about 2/3 of the birds we catch are juveniles. But 2020 was obviously a very poor breeding season for redwing, whereas 2016 was a particularly good breeding season. I've also looked at it, how the proportion of juveniles have varied in the catch through the season. So I've looked at week year for each autumn, and I've particularly chosen 2019 to 22 because those are the 4 years when I've had a decent number of birds caught over a reasonable length of time. I'm sure many of you are aware that sort of it's not until mid-October we start getting good numbers of redwing moving in. And most of the sites around here, they seem to have moved off by sort of mid-December. So particularly in 2020, I've not joined the graphs up because of such a long distance between the different points. But adults arrive earlier in the autumn, and you tend to find the first couple of weeks the catches are dominated by adults, and then you get further and further on, particularly once you get into late November and December, 70 to 80% of the birds you catch are juveniles. So it gives you an insight as to how the flock proportion changes as you go through. And also looked at mean redwing weights. So we think the majority of the redwings we get coming through here and catch are actually Scandinavian birds. Icelandic birds should be darker and a little bit bigger, and we do see the odd bird that it looks like that they're an Icelandic bird, but the vast majority, they're not easy to separate in the hand, but the vast majority I think are Scandinavian. Before I plotted this graph with weights, given that redwing from Iceland are a little bit bigger, I did do a check of mean wing length through the season, and it doesn't change at all. I mean, I haven't put any error bars on it, but the mean wing length just stayed constant right the way across. So the variation in weights here is not a reflection in larger birds, it is actually a reflection in the amount of fat. So when they first arrive, sorry, I didn't put a, yeah, sorry, so the blue line will be the adults and the orange line are the juveniles. So when they arrive, they're obviously leaner. Many of them will have not long finished their migration, may even have come in that morning. And then over the next few weeks, they gently fatten up. Now, most of the weights in week 50 are actually from this year when we had that really cold spell in December. So the adult weights did actually drop quite dramatically there. Although I think it was a fairly small sample size, most of the birds were juveniles. Anyway, as I say, that's part of sort of some casual ringing, but actually when you sit down to it, you do get some interesting data out from it. Another important thing that I'm involved with up here is I do try and take on trainees, train them to be ringers. Here is some photographs actually from this weekend. 3 of my current trainees out at Arthur's Farm near Carnarvon. Mist net there, people taking birds out of mist nets, learning how to extract, learning how to measure the wing length, fit the rings, work out aging, sexing. And it's been great fun. It's quite challenging at times, the number of trainees, because you've got a lot of students here that are moving through quite quickly. But it's also very satisfying when you know some that you've trained has ended up working for the BTO, as one of them has. Another one was a warden at Landguard for several years. Another has been assistant warden on Bardsey this year. And people are using it within their work role. So it's very, very pleasing. Although it's quite challenging when you've got 7 or 8 people who are all wanting to trade at the same time. So if people do ask me and I rebuff them, it is just because there are only so many I can cope with. Anyway, it's great fun, and it's important what we do. And we always regularly encourage people to come along with Scan Ringing Group, so they also get an experience of doing some ringing with us. And really, I'm going to leave you here with a highlight in 2020. Got the net open in the back garden, wedged and extracted it, and Goldcrest got a ring on. A Swedish ring. This was ringed 18 days previously in Sweden. So it covered 1,280 kilometers in 18 days. Just phenomenal. So you never know when your next highlight's going to be when you go out ringing. Anyway, thank you very much for listening.
Hi, Steve. I thought I'd just jump in because normally Nigel's the first there to thank you. And I'm going to let him do that much more efficiently than I am. But that was really wonderful. And I just want to say thank you so much for getting out there and doing all that for us. That's incredible. I think everyone here probably really appreciates all that data you've collected. Nigel is there. I can see him, and I'm sure he's going to come on and wrap up for us. That's what normally happens, and that is why we all pause. So I'm sorry, Stephen. I'll hand over.
You're still muted, Nigel.
Sorry, folks. Yeah, please, if you have any questions, Steve's very kindly said he'll take a few questions. Any questions out there?
Steve, can I ask about the Corsliger site and the constant effort there? You said you're ringing quite a lot of sedge warblers and reed warblers. Any interesting ringing recoveries there of birds that have been ringed on passage elsewhere?
Yes, indeed. I had intended to have got a map together to put in the chalk, and I'm very sorry, just life in the last 10 days has got too much. But yes, we have had a lot of recoveries, particularly sedge warbler, well, both species. Some on passage going through the UK, and quite a lot are being caught on passage in France. There's a number of sites where the French are now doing a lot of autumn passage ringing. So we've had quite a number of recaptures there. We've had at least 2 in Portugal of reed warblers. And we caught 1 sedge warbler at one of the swallow roosts that had been ringed previously in Perth. So obviously passing down through Corsliger on its migration south.
Very interesting. If you ever catch a aquatic warbler, please have me on speed dial.
Yeah, we'll keep our fingers crossed.
That probably applies to most of us. What's the status of ringing at the scale you do it, Steve, elsewhere in Europe? I mean, is Britain better than most other countries, or are there other countries that we should be, taking lead from?
BTO and the British ringing scheme is generally thought to be one of the best schemes in the world. We have particularly high standards, although it's all peer-reviewed training. You know, people do have to train for a long time to get a license, and some people don't ever get the aptitude. You know, it can be tricky when you have to talk to somebody and say, well, you know, I know you're really keen, but you just haven't got the techniques. So yes, you know, our standards are high. BTO are leading in a lot of these schemes to make ringing very effective for monitoring. So ringing originated by people wanting to know where our birds went to on migration. And for the majority of species, that question is largely answered. You've always got to be alert that with climate change, these things may well change in themselves. You know, for example, if I go back to my old stalwart of waders, quite a lot of dunlin and other wader species are tending with mild winters to stay over in the Wadden Sea rather than coming over to UK. So our declines in numbers of dunlin, for example, on Webb's counts is not necessarily because they're doing poorer as a global population, but because of changing migration routes. So, you know, that's important to continue to monitor. But BTO have really gone a long way with developing constant effort sites so as to be able to do rigorous science that complements things like BBSs. You know, it's quite challenging to go out on a morning and really work out how many reed warblers you've actually got singing in coarse figure, and to make that consistent year to year, as I'm sure Ian would fully admit, it's quite challenging. Whereas catching them, you've got a more standardized method of sampling. And nest record schemes are fantastic at looking how nests survive, but actually apart from constant effort site, there's no metric of actual juvenile productivity. So it is something that's over and beyond the nest record scheme. And adult survival is very crucial to be monitoring for the long term, because we never know when it's going to be important. You know, curlew declines because of the paper that Rachel and I wrote a few years ago, looking at curlew survival on Triclavan, and the fact that over the previous 30 years, it's staying consistent, or in actual fact had improved. We're able to say, well, actually, we are quite happy that adult survival is not contributing to the decline in breeding curlew. And therefore, you know, RSPB and others could concentrate their research on what we could do to improve breeding productivity.
Thank you, Steve, very much for that answer. Any other questions for Steve?
Steve, thanks for the talk. Much appreciated. Very good. It was excellent. You said that when you were ringing redwings, how certain are you when you think you've had Icelandic redwings?
Not desperately. I've had the odd one that's been really dark and has had a longer wing length. But, you know, it's sort of 1 or 2 out of 50 or 100.
I mean, I think I've only ever seen one in North Wales that I've been aware of, and it was just, I think it was late April, and a neighbour called me into the garden, and I just took loads of photographs of it, and then grilled it and realised how dark they are, and like the streaking on the flanks. It was a bit like comparing a meadow pipit to a rock pipit, but it was quite, you know, when you look at it, you think, oh yeah, crikey. And then, you know, I started looking at some pictures of birds I'd seen in Iceland, and they are quite distinctive, but I don't know. I think they are pretty scarce in Wales. I think maybe it's something that we should grill a bit more and, you know, sort of see and try and work out exactly how common they are.
No, and I think, Steve, I think you're absolutely right. They are really pretty uncommon. You know, it's one of these, you got them in the hand and you scratch your head. And, you know, I have seen the odd one that I think is Icelandic, but it really is pretty uncommon.
Yeah. Yeah. Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve.
Thank you.
Steve, can I ask about that ryegrass seed project for yellowhammers? Was it successful? Were the ryegrass beds used by the yellowhammers?
Yes, it varied field to field. Certainly in Shropshire, it was very successful.
Mm.
In Wales, we had a couple of fields that we did have good usage. One down on the Fleet Peninsula, where we were working with an estate. That was very, very successful. And one of the fields in the Glasslyn Valley was also very successful.
Mm-hmm.
The real challenge in Wales was that because there is so little really highly improved quality ryegrass,
Mm-hmm.
the farmers were extremely precious about it.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I mean, Will Peach just said, well, just offer them more money. But that wasn't really how farmers took it.
Mm.
They're very focused on they need to take enough silage in to keep their stock through the winter.
Yeah.
And even sacrificing half a hectare was more than many of them were prepared to.
Mm. Mm.
So that proved to be the issue. But if you make a good seed crop, and it is important to encourage farmers to fertilize it and make sure it is a good seed crop, because you're ending up with sort of 100 stems in a square meter. It's an awful lot of seed, and although it's not a big seed rich, not a big seed, they can run the beaks up it and sort of eat 6 or 8 seeds at a time.
Mm.
And its other advantage is that when a lot of the cereal based crops get run out in February time, this is fine right the way through and is used still up until early April.
Really?
So it potentially can help with the late winter grab.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. I asked that question really on behalf of dear Cedric, whose one of his favourite birds was yellowhammer, and he would have been very interested in your answer and that approach. Can I ask, are there any more CES sites planned for Wales? You mentioned there are 10 at the moment. Do you envisage there being many more in the next decade?
The BTO would love there to be more. It is a big time commitment. And at the end of the day, it's up to the volunteer ringers to choose to do it. You are encouraged. So a lot of the BTO ringing scheme is funded by ringers themselves, but there is some money that comes from JNCC, and BTO targets it towards particular projects they want that are of particular conservation or scientific value. And one of those is constant effort site. So you do get financial incentive to have a constant effort site. But, it is quite a commitment to say, I'm going to be going out 12 consecutive 10-day periods through the summer. And many people operate between several ringers to share a constant effort site so that they've not got quite the same commitment. Yeah. We're a bit short of spare ringers up in this part of the world to sort of infill with us. Right. Thankfully, Phil Woolen and Rosie Hall managed to infill the 2 sessions last summer when we were away, but it is quite a commitment. Yeah. It would be great to get, other people trained up to actually want to be independent ringers and potentially start their own sites up in North Wales, this section of North Wales. The small drawback of training students is they go on and move to other areas.
Yeah. Let's just take the opportunity with Steve, just drawing on his experience from Herefordshire and everything, and his comments about the supplementary seed feeding. Birds like corn bunting are doing really well in northeast Scotland, but you might be able to find one around Bettisfield on the Clwyd England border, but or Welsh England border, but they're rarest hen's teeth in Wales. Do you see any prospect at all of getting a bird like that back into Wales in numbers?
I think it'd be really quite challenging, Martin. They are very much a bird of arable farmland. I mean, not exclusively, but they are particularly an arable farmland bird. I think farming is actually ending up more and more polarized. I mean, one of the reasons we were doing a lot of the work 15 years ago in Shropshire and Staffordshire was it was a landscape that's heavily dairy dominated. And dairy farmers were using intensive ryegrass and maize is also extremely bland and boring for birds. And what we were trying to encourage farmers was to try and use cereals for some of their silage. You can actually grow very good silage to whole crop with either spring barley or winter wheat. And when we were working with a number of farms with that, it was very good quality silage. We were working with Harper Adams, who did quite a lot of the work. And we were also working with Reading University, who looked at invertebrates and weeds on the various crops. So it was extremely useful. And it was good for birds, because if you got winter wheat, you get skylarks and yellowhammers and tree sparrows into the fields, where you wouldn't get them into solid ryegrass, and likewise you wouldn't get them into maize. But it's trying to encourage that sort of crop into Wales, even though we were showing how good it was and encouraging DEFRA to sort of put funding within some of the agri-environment schemes. It's still difficult persuading farmers.
Well, thanks for that salutary remark at the end there, Stephen. That may I think sort of wrap up our questioning for this evening. Goodness, you've given us enough time of your time this evening, for which we're extremely grateful, and it's my pleasure to round up the evening and thank you more formally on behalf of everybody. You mentioned there at the end the time commitment that is involved with CES, and indeed all the ringing schemes and the individual ringing that you have done, and I think everybody hearing your talk this evening will equate with that. It's quite remarkable what physical and mental effort goes into bird ringing in all of these schemes that you've described so thoroughly this evening. And it's not for everybody. I think there's very few of us could actually commit like you and Rachel and other ringers do, day in, day out, night in, night out, for the benefit of birds and conservation. But you've really brought it home to us this evening what is involved and what the value of it is, what fabulous results come from it. And it's been absolutely fascinating. And I think always one good mark of a good talk is the range and number of questions such as we've had this evening, and indeed the depth of the answers that you've given us. The talk, as it were, carried on through the questions and the answers that you gave, and thank you very much for considering all our questions so thoroughly. I think the combination of hearing you speak tonight about your individual efforts and hearing Juliet speak on Tuesday about the combined efforts of all the ringers and other people closely involved with bird monitoring has been truly educational this week. It's been an eye-opener. Certainly has been for me, and I can imagine everybody that's had the pleasure of listening to one or both of the talks. We've been really treated this week to a masterclass in the value of science to underpinning bird conservation. The application of modern techniques is wonderful, but I'm I think constantly reminded through what you do of the continuing value of bird ringing as a key marker for understanding birds. And it's wonderful when all the different techniques combine together, prove their worth, complement one another. The ground truthing of charging after birds in a boat, as opposed to looking at the satellite data was fascinating. It's all been fascinating, and we take our hat off to you, to Rachel, your partner in crime and partner in reality, and everybody else that's done their bit for bird ringing. I know there are many people out there who've got a lot to thank you for in terms of the opportunities you've given them, the skills you've inculcated them with through training them as ringers, and the joy that you've given them perhaps as casual observers of the ringing process, like I've often had the joy of, both on the seashore and in my own garden. These are magic moments for most people when they get to see a bird in the hand and hear about its life history. And it was fitting, I think, too, that you ended with that wonderful goldcrest and reminded us that of all the thousands, hundreds of thousands of birds that you must ring, they're all individuals and they all have their own story, and they're really special. as was the talk tonight, Steve. Thanks ever so much. Once again, you've given us a brilliant evening. We thank you for this one and those in the past, and hopefully look forward to a few more in the future, whether by Zoom or face-to-face. Thanks ever so much for putting it all together tonight and giving us the benefit of your 40 odd years of bird ringing experience. Brilliant. Thank you.